17 of the fantasy football season. If you've made your championship in your fantasy league, congratulations. And here's the top 12 defenses I'm ranking here for week 17. The first defense I got this week's the New England Patriots. So the Patriots, the last few weeks here, their defense, they haven't been putting up big fantasy numbers, but it's been tough matchups as well for this defense. Week 13 at Buffalo, 10 points allowed, 2 sacks, a fumble recovery in that crazy wind game on Monday Night Football. Week 15 at Indianapolis, 27 points allowed, a sack and an into. And week 16 versus Buffalo, 33 points allowed in that one. But right here, week 17, an amazing matchup versus the Jacksonville Jaguars here for the Patriots. I give up the most fantasy points to defenses on the season. So the Patriots here, they're going to get to Trevor Lawrence early and often, in my opinion. Lawrence, it just hasn't been a good rookie season for the number one overall pick coming into the season in the NFL draft. And this Patriot team, we've seen them put up huge numbers on the defensive side of things versus bad offenses. So I think this week here, they're the number one team on the defensive side of things. And I think they easily could get anywhere from 15 to 20 fantasy points, while possibly finding the end zone with 3 or 4 sacks, at least in this one. The next defense, number 2, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So the Bucs here, a lot of injuries this season on the offensive side and defensive side of the ball. But an amazing matchup at the New York Jets that give up the 6th most fantasy points to DSTs on the season. So the last few games here for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, the 27 points allowed in Week 14 versus Buffalo, 3 sacks and an into. Week 15 versus New Orleans, 9 points allowed, 2 sacks. And Week 16 at the Panthers, 6 points allowed, 7 sacks, and an interception. So last week they versed the second worst team offensively on the year, giving points to defense in the Panthers, and they came through with a big fantasy day. But this week here, Zach Wilson is going to be running a lot and getting hit a lot in this ball game, and he'll make a few turnovers as well. So I think the Bucs here go into MetLife Stadium, take care of business, and their defense has a huge day. And I got them in number 2. Number 3, the Buffalo Bills. So the Bills here with another great matchup this week here versus the Atlanta Falcons. I give up the 3rd most fantasy points to defenses on the season. So the last few weeks here for this Bill defense. Week 14 at Tampa, 33 points allowed, 2 sacks. Week 15 versus the Panthers, 14 points allowed, 4 sacks and an into. And Week 16, a mediocre game in New England, 21 points allowed, a sack and 2 intos. Atlanta here, like I mentioned, 3rd most fantasy points to DSTs on the season. And right here, I think this Buffalo team, they're going to make a few plays. Matt Ryan, he just hasn't been all that good this season here for this Falcon team. And it's not totally his fault. The lack of weapons as well, with only Kyle Pitts and Russell Gage, his 2 main weapons in that offense. And they're not totally putting up huge numbers this season. So I think the Bills in this one, a home game for them, probably going to be cold weather or wet or snowy, whatever the case may be in Sunday's game. And Matt Ryan, we know he's a different quarterback on the road than he is at home throughout his career. And I think the Bills tee off in this one and have a big fantasy day. Number 4, the San Francisco 49ers. So the Niners, they're a hot and cold defense this season here. But I think the Niners, they're going to have a great game versus the Houston Texans. I give up the 7th most fantasy points to defenses on the season. So the last few weeks here for this 49er defense. Week 14 at Cincinnati, a pretty good offense, 23 points allowed, 5 sacks in that one and 2 fumble recoveries. Week 15 versus Atlanta, 13 points allowed, 3 sacks, a fumble recovery. And Week 16 at Tennessee, 20 points allowed and 4 sacks. So right here, it's going to be another good game for San Francisco. I know last week they put up a huge number with Houston, 41 points they scored versus the Los Angeles Chargers. But Houston, they're a better team at home, even though they're not that much better than they are on the road. And going into a tough environment like San Francisco, it's going to be a tough game for them. Davis Mills, I'm sure, is going to turn the ball over at least 2 or 3 times in this one and get sacked 3 or 4 times as well. So I think the 49ers have one of their better performances all season here with a big ball game. And I got them in number 4. Number 5, the Chicago Bears. So the Bears here, 1 week only. Big start at the DST position for fantasy owners with an amazing matchup versus the New York Giants that give up the 8th most fantasy points to defenses on the season. So the last few games here for Chicago, they really haven't done much. Like I mentioned, Week 14 at Green Bay, 39 points allowed, 3 sacks, and a return touchdown. Week 15 versus Minnesota, 17 points allowed, 4 sacks and into. And Week 16 in Seattle, 24 points allowed and 2 sacks. So right here, great matchup versus the Giants. He's either going to be Fromm or Glennon starting. But in my opinion, it doesn't matter who's starting this ball game. I think Robert Quinn, who's been one of the best pass rushers this season in terms of sack. He's going to get to the quarterback early and often. The Bears, like I mentioned, they can make some plays on the special team side of things with Jakeem Grant being a good returner. And this ball game, I think it's a low-scoring game, mid-teens, low 20s between these two teams. But I think the Chicago Bears have a great defensive game, and I got them in number 5, number 6, the New Orleans Saints. So the Saints here, they've been a pretty decent unit this season on the defensive side of things. And we saw him even a few weeks ago shut out Tom Brady and the Tampa Bay Bucks, even though I know 3 of his main guys went down in Evans, Fournette, and Godwin in this ball game. So the last few games here for the Saints, Week 14 at the Jets, 9 points allowed, 3 sacks. Week 15 at Tampa, the shutout, 4 sacks, and into a fumble recovery. And then on Monday Night Football, Book just put his defense in bad positions with short drives and punting deep in their own territory, and also with a few interceptions with 14 points allowed, 3 sacks, and an into versus Miami. But right here, great matchup versus the Saints versus the Panthers that give up the second most fantasy points to defenses on the season. And Taysom Hill, he should be back in this ball game. Is Hill here coming off the protocol list where he already missed that ball game in Week 16. So I think the Saints here, whoever the quarterback's going to be, it's just a mess over there in Carolina. Cam Newton hasn't been good in his return this season to the Panthers. And Sam Darnold, he got off to a great start early in the year, but he's been banged up and obviously didn't look too good last week when they were splitting snaps between Newton and Darnold. So in this week, if you have to use 2 quarterbacks, you really don't have any. And I think this Saint defense in this ball game has a good game, and they're at home in this one, and they're going to bounce back with a great performance. Number 7, the Los Angeles Rams. So the Rams here, we know they got the 3 studs on defense, and Aaron Donald, Jalen Ramsey, and trading for Von Miller earlier in the season near the NFL trade deadline. So they got a tough matchup at Baltimore. Not an easy place to play for a defense. And Lamar Jackson should be back and playing. But to be honest, I don't think Lamar's 100%. The Ravens, they're going to need this game bad no matter if he's 100% or not, and they're going to trot him out there. So the last few weeks here for this Ram defense, they've still been pretty solid. Week 14 at Arizona, 23 points allowed, 4 sacks, 2 interceptions. Week 15 versus Seattle, 10 points allowed, 3 sacks, and an into. And then last week, Week 16 at Minnesota, 23 points allowed, 3 sacks, an into, and a return touchdown. So right here, like I mentioned, Lamar Jackson should be back in this game. But Lamar this season, he's been up and down most of the weeks here. He takes a lot of sacks. He's been holding on to the football too much here. And he's also been sack prone, like I mentioned, and turn over the ball a decent amount of times. So with these big-time players like Donald, Miller, and Ramsey, I think they can make a few plays in this game. The Rams are on a nice hot streak now, winning 4 games in a row. And they got to go in there in Baltimore and take care of business. So I think in this one, the Rams, they'll still give up 20, 25 points to this Raven team, but I think they can make some plays, a couple interceptions, get a few sacks on Jackson. And right now, this week, they got too much talent not to even be in the top 10. So I got them at number 7. Number 8, the Seattle Seahawks. So the Seahawks here, they've been a decent unit, surprisingly, over the last month of the season here. And this week, they got a great matchup versus the Detroit Lions. That give up the 9th most fantasy points to defenses on the season. So the last few weeks here for Seattle, Week 14 at Houston, 13 points allowed, 2 sacks. Week 15 at the Rams, 20 points allowed, 4 sacks, and interception. And Week 16 versus the Bears, 25 points allowed, 4 sacks in that one. So right here, we don't know if Goff's going to play. He did come off the COVID list, but now he's dealing with a knee strain. So Boyle might be the quarterback again. And last week, Boyle, he wasn't totally a scrub, even though I know it was versus a weak Atlanta Falcon defense. But right here, I think he's going to have some turnovers. He's going into the 12th man over there in Seattle. No matter if it's Goff or Boyle, either one, I think the Seattle Seahawks defense will make a few plays, get a few sacks in this ball game, and score anywhere from 8 to 10 fantasy points. Number 9, the Indianapolis Colts. So the Colts, them and the Dallas Cowboys, the top 2 teams in turnovers created this season here. And the Colts, they got a pretty good matchup versus the Vegas Raiders. I know Carson Wentz might not play in this ball game since he's on the protocol list, and we'll see if he gets cleared in time before Sunday's ball game. But right here, like I mentioned, the Colts are creating turnovers, and they got a good matchup versus the Raiders in Indianapolis here. The Raiders give up the 13th most fantasy points to DSTs on the season, and Derek Carr's a different quarterback on the road than he is at home. So the last few games here for this Colt defense, Week 13 at Houston, they got the shutout, 4 sacks and interception, fumble recovery. Week 15 versus the Patriots, 17 points allowed, a sack, 2 interceptions in that one, including a touchdown on a block kick. In Week 16 at Arizona, 16 points allowed and a safety. So right here, I think they could get some turnovers in this ball game. Like I mentioned, Derek Carr, he turns over the ball a decent amount of times. And like I mentioned, it's a road game for the Raiders. So right here, I think the Colts, even if Wentz don't play, this defense is going to come to play in this ball game and have a pretty good ball game. And I like them number 9. Number 10, the Philadelphia Eagles. So the Eagles, believe it or not, they've been one of the hottest teams in all pro football over the last 6 or 7 weeks here. And they got another great matchup at the Washington football team that we just saw get trounced 56-14 by the Dallas Cowboys, where the Cowboys scored a touchdown on defense and made a few big plays in that ball game. So right here, Philly versus Washington a few weeks ago, and didn't have the greatest of performances. But this Philly team, like I mentioned right now, they've won 6 out of the last 7 ball games. Week 13 at the Jets, their defense, 18 points allowed, 2 sacks in it though. Week 15 versus the same Washington team, 17 points allowed, 2 sacks. And then last week versus the Giants, they had a field day, 10 points allowed, 2 sacks, 2 interceptions, including a pick 6. So right here, Washington gives up the 5th most fantasy points to defenses. Heineke last week, he was mauled by that Dallas Cowboy defense, and they really picked them apart in that one. I don't think the Eagles will have a performance like Dallas did last week, but they're definitely a top 10 defense this week. And I got them at number 10. Number 11, the Tennessee Titans. So the Titans here, they've been a hit-or-miss type of defense this season, but they got a pretty good matchup on paper versus Tua Tagovailoa and the Miami Dolphins that give up the 10th most fantasy points to DSTs on the season. So the last few games here for this Titan defense, Week 14 versus the Jags, they got the shutout, 3 sacks, 4 interceptions. Week 15 at the Steelers, 19 points allowed, 3 sacks. And Week 16 versus San Francisco, a pretty decent offense, 17 points allowed, 2 sacks, and 2 windows. So right here, I could see a similar type of fantasy game like they had in Week 16 for this Titan team, where they get 2 or 3 turnovers, they get a couple sacks on Tua Tagovailoa, and they're a decent play, and they're at home as well, where they play a way better defense at home as Tennessee than they do on the road. So I like them at number 11, and the 12th and final defense I'm ranking this week's the Dallas Cowboys. So like I mentioned early in the video, the Colts and Cowboys leading the league in turnovers this season on defense. But this week, a very tough matchup versus Kyler Murray and this Arizona Cardinal offense. And the Cowboys, they've had trouble the last few years with running quarterbacks. And I think in this one, Murray's going to take off more. And that's when he's at his best, because when Murray's holding on to the football and scrambling around a lot, that's where he gets in trouble. And that's why Arizona's been losing a decent amount over the last 4 weeks of the season. So the last few weeks here for this Cowboy defense, they've been the best defense in fantasy football the last month. Week 14 at Washington, 14 points allowed, 5 sacks, an interception, 3 fumble recoveries, and a touchdown off one with a block kick. Week 15 at the Giants, 6 points allowed, a sack, 3 interceptions, and a fumble recovery. And then Week 16 versus Washington, they trounced them in that ball game, 56-14, 14 points allowed, 5 sacks, 2 interceptions, and 2 touchdowns, 1 on a pick 6 and 1 on a block kick. So this Cowboy defense, they're turning the ball over a lot, 3 or 4 takeaways over the last few weeks here. But this Arizona Cardinal offense is something this Cowboy defense hasn't versed in weeks here. So right here, it's going to be a test for the defense. And I don't think they'll put up huge numbers. Maybe they'll get a pick or 2 in this game, but not much more in my opinion. And I definitely could see this being a shootout between these 2 teams. So that's the top 12 defenses I'm ranking here for Week 17 of the fantasy football season.